Welcome to The Explainer, where we distill complex sources into clear, focused presentations.
So, let's just jump right in, shall we? We're going to tackle this question by looking at a fascinating source, one that uses the historical figure John Brown as a kind of lens to analyze some very modern and, let's be honest, very contentious events.
Okay, so the source we're digging into today is from an analysis titled John Brown Today. And its whole premise, its whole idea, is that John Brown's life gives us this really unique and, sometimes pretty challenging way to understand the world we're living in right now.
All right, first up, the analysis kicks off with a big topic, Zionism. The source really dives into the ideology's origins to build a case for why, according to them, John Brown would have been completely against its modern form.
And right off the bat, the source makes a really key distinction. It argues that Zionism isn't some ancient religious movement. Instead, it's framed as a modern, political, and nationalist adaptation of Jewish identity, something that was born out of a very specific historical moment in 19th century Europe.
So this timeline here, it really lays out the source's argument for how anti-Semitism changed over time. The idea is that it shifted from the centuries-old religious-based hatred to a whole new, racialized ideology. And that, in turn, is what directly fueled the creation of the political Zionist movement, as a response to all that persecution.
And this chart really drives home that core distinction the source is making. You've got, on one hand, their view of traditional religious Judaism, which is all about faith. And then on the other, you have Zionism, presented as this political, nationalist framework, often led by secular folks and totally focused on the idea of a state.
Okay, so this all builds up to the source's central argument, that the ideology itself just completely transformed. What started out, in their words, as a dream of liberation from European anti-Semitism, well, it became what they call a nightmare once it was put into practice in Palestine. They argue it basically mirrored what American settlers did, by displacing an indigenous population. So then, the source wraps up this whole section with these 4 key points. The argument basically is that if you look at everything John Brown stood for, his defense of the oppressed, his deep, deep faith, his opposition to racial ideologies, there's just no way he wouldn't have stood firmly against the political state of Israel.
All right, now building on that theme of ideology, the analysis makes a big shift. We're moving from international politics to a domestic tragedy. The source applies that same John Brown lens to critique Christian nationalism, but this time through the really complex idea of martyrdom.
So next, the source brings up the tragic killing of conservative commentator Charlie Kirk and uses it as a case study. Now, the analysis is very clear. It's not questioning the tragedy of his death at all. What it is doing is examining the push to call him a martyr and asking, wait a minute, what does that word even mean according to its own framework?
And to build this argument, the host goes all the way back to the original Greek root of the word martyr, which is martyrio, and it just means witness. So the question then becomes, a witness to what? The point is, the cause you live and die for is everything.
Then the source lays out this really stark comparison. On one side, it frames John Brown as a liberationist Christian who was, let's not forget, ultimately hanged by the Christian nationalists of his own time. And then, in contrast, it portrays Charlie Kirk's work as promoting a very similar nationalist ideology, and it points to his rhetoric against the civil rights movement as proof.
And this is where the host's argument really comes to a head, the idea that a martyr's cause is every bit as important as their death. So, based on that, the source flat out rejects the idea of Charlie Kirk as a godly martyr. Why? Because it argues his witness was for a cause that, in their view, runs completely counter to justice.
Okay, for the final piece of the analysis, the source ties all of these ideas directly to the here and now. It focuses on what it calls a modern-day battle over American history, and specifically, over the memory of the nation's injustices.
And the argument here is that there's this concerted political push to tell a sanitized version of America's past. One that only focuses on the good things while deliberately pushing the history of slavery and oppression into the background or just removing it altogether.
And to explain how this works, the source breaks this alleged revisionism down into a really clear 3-step playbook you can see right here. Step 1, just deny the injustice ever happened. Step 2, get rid of the physical evidence. And Step 3, censor the books and materials that actually teach that history.
And this, right here, is what brings it all back to John Brown. The host's big concern is that any time you try to censor the history of slavery, you inevitably end up diminishing the story of the people who fought against it.
And that makes John Brown's legacy, well, collateral damage in this bigger war over historical truth.
So, we've looked at Zionism, martyrdom, and this whole battle over history. After all that, what's the big takeaway from this analysis?
Well, the source wraps everything up by framing John Brown not as just some figure from a history book, but as this enduring symbol for an ongoing struggle for justice. And that struggle, they argue, demands that we defend the oppressed and confront inconvenient truths, head on.
And that leaves us with one last, really provocative thought to chew on. It's a challenge, really, for all of us to think about the role that history and the figures inside it should play in how we try to navigate the incredibly complex challenges we're all facing right now.